When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, it stays with you. User, Lost TB. Posted, September 28, 1996.
Last night on my drive home from work, I saw my first dead body. Two cars had collided head-on on the parkway and snarled traffic for miles in either direction, though I didn't know that at first. Usually, after 11, the road is a long, empty stretch of glossy black asphalt, but last night it was a parking lot. It's been a humid summer and the air conditioner in my car is busted, so I spent the better part of an hour staring out at a sea of taillights and breathing exhaust. It had to have been just after midnight when the line of cars creeped forward enough for me to see the collision that had slowed us down. It was bad. What looked like it had been a brand new Celica crossed the center line and nailed an old beater Jeep. Emergency responders had arranged their vehicles around the accident in such a way as to keep outside visibility to a minimum, but through the flashing blue and red lights, I could still make out firefighters cutting the door off the car to get at the driver. Considering how the front end of the Celica was crumpled in like a beer can, it was hard to imagine they were still alive. I craned my neck to see the Jeep and immediately regretted it. There wasn't as much damage to the body, but the top had been down and it looked as though the driver had been thrown out on impact. Proof of this lay in the long, bloody skid mark along the pavement, at the end of which was a lumpy object draped in white sheeting. I said a quick thanks for not having to actually see the damage, but spoke too soon. A moment later, the firefighters were tugging on the driver, and one of them cursed as they pulled only the top half of him from the wreckage. The man's shining viscera began to drop out of him, making a wet, spreading sound as it slammed down onto the pavement. I couldn't really make sense of it. This was something you only saw in movies where you knew that afterward someone yelled cut and everyone did a bunch of blow. But this wasn't a movie, and that man was never getting back up again. Traffic had stopped completely again, so I sat there with a front row seat as they gently placed the man's torso and organs into a black body bag, the coarse material rustling with each movement. A coppery odor began to waft through the window, metallic and sweet at the same time, and when I realized what it was, I vomited out of the window. Naturally, every single fireman, cop, and paramedic heard and looked toward me at the same time, and I felt like a kid on his first day of school. One of the paramedics, a tall, wiry woman with red hair pulled back into a tight bun, graciously came over to check on me. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She handed me a couple gauze pads so I could wipe my mouth. "Yeah, no, that's the worst thing I've ever seen, but I guess I shouldn't complain. You must see this all the time." She gave me a thin-lipped smile. "Do you feel lightheaded at all?" I shook my head. "No, nothing like that. I could just smell it all of a sudden." Her face softened a little. I understand. The smell still sometimes gets me too. It stays with you. How are you feeling now? I'm okay, just really looking forward to getting home, you know? She nodded. I do. Drive safe, ma'am, and if you do start to feel nauseous again or lightheaded, make sure you pull over till it passes. I said I would, and she walked back to the others, outlined by red emergency lights. When I finally got home, I was exhausted and wired at the same time. Laying in bed wasn't an option, so I turned on HBO and tossed a slice of leftover pizza into the microwave. When it was done, I flopped onto the sofa in the living room and tried to get invested in the movie that was on. It was Beastmaster because, of course it was. I'm 98% sure that HBO stands for Hey, Beastmaster's on. The advantage of Beastmaster being on nearly constantly is that it's become a mindless way to relax after work, but last night it only made things worse. Whereas I usually enjoyed watching Dar use a sword to dispatch Max's goons, now all I could think about was what was inside each of those soldiers. Cold steel slicing through fascia and muscle into the intestines, churning up their guts until they were a slurry that ran out through their open wounds. The rubbery cheese and slick sauce on my pizza nauseated me, so I tossed the plate down on my coffee table. The sudden bang startled me so badly I flinched, and that's when I heard a rustling sound. It wasn't a sound I had ever heard in my house before and hadn't seemed to come from anywhere in particular, stopping as quickly as it had started. I stood up looking around for its origin. Everything was as it should be, the small jungle of ferns along one wall, the bookshelves along another. On the TV, Dar, Kiri, and Tal were trying to rescue King Zed, but something about it felt all wrong. Sinister somehow, as if there was a secondary image behind the one I was looking at. Again, I heard the rustling sound longer this time. It sounded as though it may have been coming from the direction of the stairs. I pulled my keys from my pocket and made a fist around them. It was something they taught us in self-defense class, the idea being that getting punched in the face with sharp objects might be enough to deter a mugger or a rapist. I never tried it before, but it was a night of firsts. I crept towards the bottom of the stairs, and from there, I could see the first landing and the bottom of the second flight. I held my breath, waiting for footsteps or something else that might give away what was going on. There it was again. I knew exactly what it was. As the thought occurred to me, the body bag came into view, descending the upper stairs. Fear turned my brain off completely, and I froze in place. It didn't step as much as it slid, each movement accompanied by a liquid sloshing sound. It slumped down on the landing with a thud, slouching inch by inch around the corner until it faced me. The body bag was vertical, bulging at the base like the loose parts were pooling, waiting to spill out. Its zipper swayed back and forth hypnotically, gleaming in the light as if to draw my eyes toward it. It worked. I became fixated on the metal tab, watching helplessly as invisible hands drew it downward. The zipper gradually revealed a void from which poured a torrent of gore. A wave of offal surged out of the bag and down the stairs, more than it could ever have possibly held. I raised my hands in defense and felt the sticky softness of organ meat slam into me, borne on a tide of blood. I smelled its coppery sweetness for a moment before my lungs began to fill. As I lost consciousness, I heard the paramedic's voice in my head. It stays with you. When I woke up in the morning, I was on the sofa, the TV still tuned to HBO. On the coffee table, there was a piece of cold pizza, the plate underneath it cracked from where I dropped it. My mouth still tasted of blood, and I jumped to my feet, whirling toward the stairs. They were clean, the body bag nowhere to be found, but why was I tasting blood? I dragged my tongue around my mouth and felt pain. I must have bitten it in my sleep. Running a hand over my face, I lay back down on the sofa and closed my eyes. The dream still felt right there, as if all I had to do to see the body bag again was squint just so. But my neighbor's car backfired as it pulled out of the driveway, and in the silence afterward, I heard birdsong. The waking world was reasserting itself.
Subject, Territorial. User, null4bur. Posted, May 27, 1998.
When you've had the same job for 10 years, having to look for work again is a colossal pain in the ass. What makes it especially difficult for me is that I never went to college, so to look at my resume, a prospective employer would think, this guy got out of school and then worked the front desk of a hotel for 10 years. He's functionally useless for anything that doesn't involve handing guests a pen to write their name with. And sure, the first part is right in that just out of high school, I blundered into a great job at Newmarket Manor, where I stayed for 10 years. What they're wrong about is the kind of work that job entailed, because checking guests in and answering phones was the least of it. Over the course of a decade, I became the Newmarket's chief troubleshooter, effectively managing the place, even though my official title never changed. Had they done that, they might have had to pay me more, and if they'd actually listened to me when it counted, the place might not have burned down. Newmarket Manor was one of those grand old homes built by a coal baron to house what was meant to be generations of his family. However, in this case, that coal baron, Leonard Corden, had particularly useless offspring who blew through his fortune at an impressive speed. My bosses, Mike and Eleanor, picked the place up for a song in the 80s and turned it into Newmarket Manor, the name having nothing to do with the history of the property. Eleanor thought it sounded like old money splendor and hoped that would be the kind of clientele it attracted. It did not. That's not to cast aspersions on our guests who, despite being mostly lovely people, were vacationers from the Midwest and not the white shoe set. When I came on board in '85, the manor had been running as a hotel for about 4 years, and people still called it the Old Corden House. Back then, if a passing tourist asked someone local where they might find a haunted house, 9 out of 10 people would point toward the hotel. It had been sitting empty for so long that the effort Mike and Eleanor had put into repainting its peeling blue exterior and repairing its intricate gingerbread trim, not to mention evicting the raccoons and roaches from its battered interior, barely registered. It took a lot of careful work on the PR front to change perceptions of the Newmarket, but we got there. To my surprise, the most important part of that process was hiding the fact that the place was actually haunted. It's impossible to say who or what was haunting the place. All I knew for sure was that if the front desk phone rang after, say, 9:30, you could be sure it was someone asking why they could hear breathing in their otherwise empty room. I spent a good 4 hours knocking out a list of potential excuses for night staff to tell guests when I wasn't around. Faulty air conditioning or heating, insulation settling, off-gassing from new mattresses. When people are scared, they'll believe just about any comforting thing you tell them, and that was usually the end of the matter. If whatever was in there happened to be in a playful mood, You get a second phone call about the TV or bathroom faucet turning itself on, requiring a fresh set of carefully calculated excuses. There was never a third phone call, not once. If things persisted, it always ended the same way. A frantic guest in some manner of undress running up to the desk babbling about the hooded man. You only ever got this a couple times per year, mostly in October, and when it happened, you very calmly apologized to the guest and gave them the blue room. It was a small room on the west side of the house, and for whatever reason, the one room our unknown resident never approached. Even when we had a full house, you left the blue room empty just in case. It was a good system, until it all fell apart. I suspect the change was brought about by Eleanor trying to develop the old Corden family bowling alley in the basement into a banquet space. Despite it running almost half the length of the hotel, it had sat completely untouched the entire time I'd worked there. It had this strange effect on people, almost like you'd forgot it existed until you were walking past the doors on the way to cold storage. As soon as it was out of sight, it just faded from your awareness. Or at least it did until boss lady got a bee in her bonnet about leaving money on the table and sent me down there to assess the space. In all of the 10 years I'd worked there, I'd come to accept the place was haunted, even if I never once saw or felt the spirit that liked to bother our guests. I certainly never felt unsafe. Down in that bowling alley, though, I felt unsafe, like I'd wandered into the home of a very territorial animal. The lanes were intact, the floor surprisingly well kept considering how long it had been left to molder. It was the corners that weren't right. No matter how many lights you turned on, the darkness collected there like iron fillings on a magnet. I felt a pressure on my chest the moment I entered, and it grew with every passing moment. The back of my neck prickled. It took less than 5 minutes for me to run out of there, tail between my legs. For days afterward, I dreamed of the bowling alley and the darkness that gathered there. Nothing ever spoke to me in those dreams, but following each one, I became more and more certain that this was the one place in the hotel we couldn't touch. Whatever haunted it had retreated there, ceding the space to the living except for the handful of provocations we fielded every year. If we wanted to maintain a balance in Newmarket Manor, the bowling alley had to stay the way it was. Eleanor wouldn't hear a word of it. She was almost never on the property to begin with, so the day-to-day running of the place was, at best, theoretical to her. Anything resembling the supernatural may as well have been happening on another planet. It didn't matter one whit that I'd had to design an entire process to deal with disturbed guests, a process which included setting a whole room aside for emergencies. The bowling alley project began in late September last year, and sure enough, the presence's intrusions into the rest of the house ramped up at the same time. 3 nights running, we had guests straight up leave the hotel after something rushed them from the corners of their rooms. Then, 2 days before Halloween, the basement smoke alarm went off and we had to evacuate. In 2 hours of looking, the fire department couldn't find any reason for the signal and we moved guests back in. Eleanor blamed the whole thing on the contractors, claiming they'd screwed up the electrical work somehow. They were fired, putting a stop to the work for the next 2 weeks. Unsurprisingly, the balance returned to the rest of the house without a single visit from the presence. Looking back, I can see that the alarm was a warning shot, one that went unheeded. 2 weeks later, a new contractor was found and work on the bowling alley resumed. The next fire alarm was very real. The night it happened was supposed to be my first shift of the week after 2 days off. Usually on my Mondays, I woke up around 2 in the afternoon and puttered around the house until it was time for work at 5. That day, though, I felt like I was moving through molasses, and an hour before my shift was due to start, I was so exhausted I had to call one of the new hires to cover me. As soon as that call was over, I collapsed back into bed and a dreamless sleep. When I woke up the following morning, the fog of the previous day had passed and I was unemployed. The latter fact wasn't obvious to me at first, and it says a lot that I didn't find out until the firefighter manning the blockade at the bottom of the Newmarket sloping driveway filled me in. Sometime after 11, he said, a fire had started in the kitchen and spread quickly around the hotel. Thankfully, we'd had an empty house, so the only person who needed to evacuate was the night shift clerk who'd taken my shift. When I asked the firefighter how bad the damage was, he gave me a look of sympathy. The hotel was gone, he said, burned to its foundations. Better brush up that resume, kid, is how he put it. So here I am, doing just that.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.